They say the dead can't ring bells. Yet last night, one did. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below. Your words make this mystery come alive. Let's begin. It was in the twilight of a drizzly October day that the singular case of the bells beneath Bermondsey first crossed the threshold of Baker Street. A chill had settled over London, and the gas lamps were flickering to life in the gathering fog. I had just set aside a copy of the Evening Standard, which Holmes had already annotated in several places with a pencil, when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, knocked gently and ushered in a young man whose appearance suggested the urgency of his errand. He was dressed in the uniform of the London Underground Railway, the blue wool jacket damp with mist, the brass buttons dulled by long shifts in soot and steam. His gloved hands twisted the brim of his cap nervously. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice wavering. Holmes, who had been languidly sprawled upon the settee with his fingers steepled, did not rise. He merely inclined his head. "You have come from the Bermondsey Tunnel," he said. "Southbound line. You've not yet broken your fast today, and the tremor in your right hand suggests a brush with something either alarming or unnatural, perhaps both." The man blinked at Holmes, his lips parting slightly. "Yes, sir. I mean, how did you—" "My dear fellow," Holmes replied with a weary gesture, "your boots are flecked with a very particular chalk dust found only in the excavation shafts near the Bermondsey extension. The soot upon your sleeve is more recent, suggesting a mechanical concern rather than tunnel collapse, and that pallor, together with your physical agitation, implies a sight not easily explained away by steam pressure or tired nerves. Kindly sit and tell me the matter before your nervous system rebels entirely." The young man sat almost gratefully. "My name's Thomas Arledge, sir, assistant signalman for the Jubilee extension. He hesitated, then plunged on. "There were bells ringing in the tunnel last night, underground bells, and I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, there's no bell system down there." Holmes sat up now, eyes glinting with a sharpness that signalled to me his predatory interest had awakened. "What time did this occur?" "Just before the last train," said Arledge. "At 20 past midnight. I was checking a faulty junction box at the south ventilation shaft when I heard it, a high, clear chime, almost musical, not once, but 3 distinct rings, and then nothing but silence." "You are certain it came from below ground?" "Certain," Arledge nodded. "It echoed through the tunnel walls, deep but clear. And the strangest thing, sir, there were no trains scheduled at that point, and all the track alarms showed clear. I even radioed the control room. They said I was imagining it, but I'm not." Holmes rose and walked to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened, coiling like a living thing around the rooftops. "Tell me, Mr. Arledge, have there been any other disturbances?" Arledge hesitated, then nodded. 2 nights ago, the night guard said he saw a flicker of light inside one of the abandoned shafts, like a lantern moving where there shouldn't be anyone. And last week, one of the engineers resigned suddenly, wouldn't say why, just handed in his keys and left. Holmes turned, a slow smile curving his lips. "A tunnel that sings, a vanishing light, and a man who flees without explanation. Dr. Watson, I believe the game is not merely afoot, it is echoing." I reached for my overcoat. "You intend to investigate?" Holmes was already ringing for his coat and cane. "Mr. Arledge, we shall accompany you to Bermondsey this very evening. Kindly see to it that we have access to the site, and under no circumstances is the press to be informed. The last thing we need is a flurry of stories about ghosts beneath London." As Arledge left, visibly heartened, I turned to Holmes. "You do not believe in the supernatural explanation?" "Certainly not," Holmes replied with faint amusement. "If bells rang where no bells exist, then either they have been placed there in secret, or the ears that heard them were deceived. Either answer, Watson, is quite human and quite intriguing. And so, as the fog thickened and London shrank into a whisper of lamps and smoke, we set off toward the tunnels of Bermondsey, unaware that what awaited us beneath the city was far stranger than even Holmes had suspected. The fog had thickened by the time we reached Bermondsey, clinging to the gas lamps and blurring the outlines of the brickwork buildings that hunched beside the railway arches. The scent of coal smoke and damp masonry was ever present, and the rhythmic clank of unseen iron further along the line lent the atmosphere a tense, expectant cadence. Holmes walked with purposeful strides, his collar turned up against the mist, his eyes scanning everything, not for effect, but with that relentless absorption that always overtook him once a mystery had caught fire in his mind. Mr. Arledge awaited us outside a nondescript maintenance entrance marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His cap was now firmly back in place, and he carried a ring of keys that jingled as nervously as his fingers. "This way, sirs," he murmured, ushering us in with furtive glances up and down the empty street. We descended a flight of iron stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, until we emerged into a broad service corridor. It was lit intermittently by electric lamps fixed to the walls, casting long shadows across stacked crates, rusting tools, and coiled lengths of cable. The faint hum of the underground, an almost imperceptible vibration in the stone, ran beneath our feet. The spot where I heard the
"Bells is just past the south shaft, beyond the crossover switch," said Arledge, leading the way. "But I thought you might want to see this first, Mr. Holmes." He stopped before a small, locked cabinet mounted at chest height. Inside, an electrical relay box buzzed softly, wires branching like nerves across its metal face. "This junction failed at exactly the same time the bells rang," he said, unlocking it with a practiced flick of the wrist. "It hasn't shorted again since, but for that 1 minute, the entire signal grid for this section went blind. No lights, no switches, just dead silence." Holmes crouched before the open panel, his fingers trailing lightly over the dusty casing. He sniffed the air, then leaned in to inspect the wires with his lens. "Burnt insulation," he murmured, "yet no scorch marks, and the wiring is original, unaltered." He straightened, tapping the edge of the cabinet thoughtfully. "Mr. Arledge, was there any digging or rewiring done recently in this tunnel? Even unofficial work?" "No, sir. The last maintenance log shows nothing scheduled since early September." Holmes turned to me. "You see, Watson, if the system failed and no mechanical cause can be found, we must consider human interference, sophisticated enough to mimic a fault without leaving evidence of tampering. That suggests not merely mischief, but purpose." We proceeded deeper into the tunnel. As we moved farther from the main line, the electric lighting gave way to gas-fed wall lamps, their flickering flames dancing over ancient brickwork that had long since darkened with soot. The occasional clatter of distant footfalls or the thunder of a train overhead punctuated our descent. But here, in the older sections, it felt as though the city had forgotten this place. We arrived at the point where the south shaft met the track. The tunnel yawned away in both directions, a dim, curving throat of brick and steel. The rails gleamed faintly, and the air was filled with that peculiar mingling of cold stone, grease, and old steam. "This is where I stood," said Arledge quietly, indicating a narrow maintenance platform to the side of the tracks. "The sound came from down there." Holmes stepped onto the platform and raised a hand for silence. We stood motionless. A draught whispered through the shaft, and somewhere far above us a drip of water struck stone in an erratic rhythm. But no bells, only the weight of silence. He knelt suddenly and pressed his palm to the stone wall. "Resonant," he muttered. "Watson, come feel this." I obeyed, crouching beside him. The brick was cold, but there was a faint hum beneath the surface,
a subtle vibration that reminded me of the tympanic pressure one feels aboard a ship just before the engines start. "It's as if the wall itself is remembering a sound," I said. Holmes gave me a quick glance. "Just so. Sound does not travel in the same manner underground as in the open air. Frequencies bounce, echo, and sustain themselves longer, particularly if channeled deliberately." "Are you suggesting someone planted the sound?" "Precisely. Picture it. If you wish to conduct a signal, a bell tone for instance, to a specific place and time, you would need to account for acoustic resonance, interference, and the psychological context of the listener. A man alone, underground, expecting only silence? He would remember a sound more vividly than any sight." He stood and turned to Arledge. "Tell me, were there any maintenance hatches or concealed entrances in the direction from which the sound came?" "There's one old storage tunnel, sir, but it's been bricked up since 1892, an old Roman drainage route, they say. Sealed after a collapse killed a navvy crew." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Take us there." The route was narrow and uneven, and Arledge had to light a handheld lantern. The bricks along this corridor were older, thicker, and laid in a different pattern. At last we came to the sealed entrance, a crude but solid wall of mismatched stone and mortar. Holmes examined it in silence, tapping different sections with the handle of his cane. Twice he paused and pressed his ear to the wall. "There's air behind it," he said at last. "And recently disturbed mortar. Watson, note the darkened line running halfway up. Someone has replastered the seal, but it's not aged like the rest. This was opened and resealed within the year." Arledge looked stricken. "That's not possible. We'd have known. No one's logged any access." "Which is exactly how someone wanted it," Holmes said. "They wish to reach a place the city has forgotten, and they have returned, perhaps more than once." He straightened and turned back toward the tunnel mouth. "Come, Watson, we shall return tomorrow with proper tools and light. Tonight I would speak with the man who resigned without warning. Mr. Arledge, obtain his address for me at once." As we emerged once more into the cold night, Holmes was silent for several streets. I had come to recognize that expression, the narrowed eyes, the subtle stiffness in his shoulders, as a mark that he was following a thread no one else could see. "You have a theory," I said, finally breaking the silence. "A hypothesis," he corrected. "Something is being conducted beneath London, not just sound, but some operation. The ringing bells were not an accident. They were a signal meant to be heard by only one set of ears." "And what of the light in the tunnel?" Holmes exhaled a plume of breath into the mist. "A rendezvous, Watson, or a warning. But we are no longer at the threshold of a haunting. We are now at the entrance of a scheme." He halted abruptly and looked up. "Tell me, do you recall the matter of the smuggler who used the icehouse chimneys to carry code?" "Yes, of course. The Claydon cipher." "Then you will understand why I suspect these bells ring not for the dead, but for the living." The following morning broke cold and colourless, the mist having condensed into a sullen drizzle that washed the soot from the chimney stacks and sent the costermongers scurrying beneath awnings. I found Holmes already dressed and sipping a cup of black coffee when I descended to the sitting room. He was studying a scrap of paper, thin and creased. Beside it, a smudged envelope bore the return address of a public lodging house in Camden Town. Holmes looked up as I entered. "Watson, good. You are just in time to accompany me to Mr. Cyril Hankin, the engineer who resigned from the Bermondsey extension without explanation." "You've received his address?" "Courtesy of young Mr. Arledge. He made inquiries first thing this morning. Hankin left no note and no quarrel, simply collected his final pay and vanished." We arrived in Camden by hansom cab. passing through streets still glazed with the sheen of overnight rain. The lodging-house was of the sort common to the north end of London, narrow, peeling, and overseen by a thin-lipped landlady who wore her suspicion of strangers like a shawl. "You'll find him in the back," she said, after Holmes produced half a sovereign. "Keeps odd hours and talks to no one. Quiet as a rat he is, took up sketching the last week or so, draws the same thing over and over." She led us down a narrow hall and rapped on the final door. A long pause. Then a voice. "What is it?" Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Hankin, we are here regarding the Jubilee extension." Another pause, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The man who opened the door was gaunt and pale, with cheeks hollowed by recent strain. His hands trembled as he pulled the door wider, revealing a room scattered with paper, tools, and a metal engineer's case propped open beside the bed. On the desk, sheet after sheet displayed pencil sketches, tunnel walls, brick arches, shafts rendered in painstaking detail. And again, one motif, a small bell mounted not above but beneath the floor of the tunnel. Holmes entered without asking. Mr. Hankin backed away slightly but did not object. He sank into a chair and watched us with wary eyes. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he said. Holmes gave the faintest nod. "I tried to tell them," Hankin muttered, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "The others said I was ill. One even called for a company doctor, but I heard it, clear as church bells, 3 times like a summons." "And what did you do?" "I followed it." His voice dropped, eyes flicking toward the window. "Not far, just to the base of shaft 11, the old bricked section. I'd examined that shaft 100 times. But that night, the mortar in one of the seams was wet, like someone had opened it. And inside I saw—" He broke off. Holmes waited. "I saw movement. Someone dragging a crate, something heavy, down into the sealed shaft. He had a lantern, and I only caught a glimpse. I called out. He vanished, and the bells stopped. Next day I handed in my resignation." Holmes crossed to the desk and lifted one of the sketches. "You drew these after the event?" "Yes, over and over, couldn't help it. That bell, it wasn't just a noise, it had a tone, specific, tuned." "Tuned," Holmes repeated quietly. "Of course." He turned to me. "Watson, do you remember the old legend of the Temple Bell Code used during the Great Exhibition of '51? I frowned. "A set of chimes strung through the exhibition halls, wasn't it? Used to communicate across distance without speech?" "Exactly. Tuned bells, each resonating at a specific frequency, a sort of primitive Morse, transmitted by sound. Most dismissed it as a curiosity, but if one had access to a concealed network of chambers beneath the city—" He trailed off, staring at Hankin's sketches. "You believe someone is using the sealed shafts to transmit messages?" I asked. "More than messages," Holmes replied. "Instructions, coordination, perhaps even timing. Imagine a criminal network communicating beneath the very feet of the Metropolitan Police by sound alone." He turned back to Hankin. "Did you see the man's face?" "No, just his silhouette, broad-shouldered, walked with a limp." Holmes made a note of it in his pocket-book. "Thank you, Mr. Hankin. Your courage in withdrawing may have preserved your life." We left shortly after, and Holmes remained silent in the cab, drumming his fingers along the woodwork. "What now?" I asked. "We returned to Bermondsey," he said, "with tools." By midday we stood once again before the bricked-up shaft. Holmes produced a small hammer and a slender steel chisel from his satchel. "Keep watch, Watson," he murmured, and began tapping. The sound of metal on mortar echoed faintly, muffled by the thickness of the wall. After 15 minutes of work, a loosened brick tumbled inward, revealing darkness beyond.
Holmes cleared another, then pushed his lantern through. A narrow passage sloped downward, lined with old Roman brick, worn smooth. The air that issued forth was dry and cool. Holmes squeezed through and I followed. We descended perhaps 20 yards before the shaft widened into a low chamber. The walls were reinforced with modern steel beams, recent additions. Crates were stacked in the corner, and an oil lamp sat cold on a wooden table. But what drew the eye, what riveted our attention, was the device in the center of the room. It was no larger than a traveling trunk, yet studded with brass coils and fitted with wires that extended into the ceiling. Atop it sat 3 small bells, each mounted on a fine springed plate. The whole device was silent now, but its purpose was unmistakable. Holmes approached with reverence, crouching beside it. "Extraordinary," he breathed. A mechanical bell code, each
Bell struck by a timed mechanism, linked to a relay system, a sound transmitter, and likely a receiver as well. What would it transmit? He glanced at me. Whatever one wished, signals to coordinate movement, to warn of danger, to guide someone unseen through the tunnels. He picked up a small sheet of paper from the table, covered in columns of letters and bell notations. "Watson," he said slowly, "I believe we are standing in the command post of an underground smuggling network, perhaps one using the railways themselves to move goods or people. These bells were never meant to frighten. They were meant to direct." He tucked the paper into his coat and turned to leave. But before we reached the exit, a sound rang out, faint, clear, unmistakable. Chime, chime, chime. Holmes froze. "That wasn't from this room," he whispered. "That came from further down." In the sudden silence that followed, I felt my skin prickle. Holmes drew himself upright. "They know we're here," he said grimly, "and they've just sent the signal to act." The effect of those 3 soft chimes was immediate. Holmes extinguished the lantern with a swift motion and dropped into a crouch beside the wall, drawing me with him into the shadows. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the quiet throb of my pulse in my ears. Somewhere deep within the tunnels, a reply might have already been echoing, coded, unseen, and swift in its effect. Holmes touched my sleeve lightly. "Do not speak," he whispered, "and listen." We waited. Minutes passed. No further bells came. Then faintly, but growing clearer, a sound of movement. Heavy footfalls on stone. Not hurried, but deliberate. One man, perhaps 2, coming down the same narrow shaft we had just entered through. Holmes moved toward the far wall of the chamber, his hand running along the ancient brickwork until it found a recess, barely large enough for 2 to squeeze into. We took shelter just as a glow flickered at the tunnel's mouth. A figure appeared in silhouette, holding a lantern. He was tall and solidly built, with the kind of labourer's gait that suggested long years underground. As he stepped into the chamber, we could see more. A thick wool coat stained with old grease, a flat cap pulled low, and, most tellingly, a marked stiffness in the left leg. The limp. He paused beside the bell machine and crouched to examine it. From his coat he produced a small metal box with several toggles. He adjusted 2, listened, then turned to the crates. Selecting one, he removed its lid and revealed the contents within. Not weapons, nor gold, but books. Holmes gave the faintest breath beside me, and I caught the flicker of his expression in the reflected light. Not surprise, something closer to confirmation. The man closed the crate, reset the lid, and lifted a small, square packet from his coat. He laid it atop the bell machine with evident care. Then, with the same slow steps, he turned and vanished into the passage once more. Holmes waited for a full 2 minutes before moving. Then with swift strides he crossed to the device and retrieved the packet. It was wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. He undid it and unfolded a parchment within. On it, drawn with precision, was a map of the London Underground, though not as the public would recognize it. The lines were coded. Several shafts were marked with numbers, others with musical notation, A cheek, F, G cheek. At the base was a legend written in firm, angular hand. Harrow, Tuesday Tower Hill, Friday Moorgate, Hold Finchley, transfer with caution. Holmes folded the paper and replaced it in his coat. "Smuggling?" I asked, my voice low. "In a manner of speaking," Holmes murmured. "But not of the type Lestrade is used to chasing. These men are not moving contraband, they're moving knowledge." "Books?" I asked. "But for what purpose?" He turned toward me, eyes glittering. "Theft and murder are not the only reasons men conceal their actions. Consider, Watson, what if a group sought to circulate forbidden ideas, literature banned in other parts of Europe, revolutionary manifestos, radical political tracts? What better place than London to serve as a hub of dissemination, so long as one could stay invisible?" I stared at the crates. "And the bells?" "Navigation, signal, protection. If someone unknown were to enter a part of the tunnel, they'd be warned off," I finished. "Or intercepted." Holmes gave a nod. "Efficient, quiet, utterly deniable." He walked to the table and gathered several loose sheets of ciphered messages, stuffing them carefully into an inner pocket. Then he turned to the crates. "Help me open another." We pried loose the lid of the nearest. Inside were more books, titles in Russian, German and French, treatises on labour theory, anarchism and state revolution. A pamphlet bore a familiar name, Bakunin. Holmes ran a finger along the spine of one volume. "These are not trivial works. If they were intercepted in, say, Austria or Prussia, the bearer might find himself shot or imprisoned." A new noise interrupted us, the clatter of something metallic against stone near the tunnel entrance. Holmes snapped upright. That was deliberate. I moved toward the entrance, but he pulled me back. "No, Watson, we cannot risk a confrontation underground, not without knowing the numbers or layout. We withdraw, now." We moved swiftly back the way we came, retracing our steps to the surface. Holmes paused only to reset the fallen bricks in the shaft entrance, giving the illusion it remained sealed. Back in the grey drizzle of Bermondsey, Holmes lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. The adrenaline had not left him. It rarely did, until the game was truly over. "We must now speak with Lestrade," he said. "But I shall withhold certain details for the moment. Scotland Yard would view this network as a conspiracy, perhaps rightly. But an indiscriminate sweep would do more harm than good." I frowned. "You mean to protect them?" "I mean to understand them. Only then may we determine who among them is dangerous and who is merely idealistic. And there is still the matter of the bells. Someone designed that system, someone skilled, not merely in mechanics, but in acoustics, psychology, and espionage." "You believe there's a ringleader?" "There is always a ringleader," Holmes said flatly. "And I intend to meet him." That afternoon, Lestrade arrived at Baker Street after receiving Holmes's urgent note. He was tired, damp, and irritable. "This had better not be another of your theatrical flares, Holmes," he said as he removed his gloves. Holmes offered him a seat and poured a stiff measure of brandy. "What if I told you there is an entire network operating beneath London, one that uses musical codes, ancient shafts, and forgotten maps to move radical literature through the underground?" Lestrade blinked. "I'd say you'd been reading penny novels again." "And yet," Holmes continued, "I can show you the device, the chamber, the very crates of books, provided you come quietly, and without your usual parade of bobbies." Lestrade took the glass. You think they're planning violence? Holmes's expression darkened. I don't know yet, but I know this. 3 bells rang last night, not just for Mr. Arledge. They rang to signal action. Something is imminent, and if we do not understand their next step, we shall be reacting rather than preventing. Lestrade downed the brandy in one go. All right, Holmes, you have my attention, but we'll need a plan. Holmes nodded. We shall let them believe the bell has summoned silence, and in that silence we will listen harder than they ever expected. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the fog thickened once more, Holmes pulled from his bookshelf an obscure volume on acoustics and tuned resonance. I watched him as he turned its pages with care, stopping now and then to make margin notes or sketch diagrams. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "The name," he murmured. "The one man in London who could build such a machine and stay invisible while doing it." He turned the page, paused, then tapped it. "Ah, there you are." He turned the book so I could see. A lecture listing. Professor Elias Greenwood, formerly of King's College, expelled in 1889 for anarchist affiliations. Holmes smiled. "Watson, tomorrow we visit a man who once taught London how to make its own walls sing." It was a rare moment of blue in the otherwise overcast canopy above London when Holmes and I set off the next morning in search of Professor Elias Greenwood. A westerly wind cleared the fog from the rooftops and sent chimney smoke trailing flat along the horizon. The city below was still wet from the night's rain, and the wheels of our hansom sent up arcs of water as we wound our way from Baker Street toward the eastern quarter, where, according to Holmes's research, Greenwood had last been seen lecturing at an independent mechanics institute. The cab drew up outside a narrow brick building squeezed between a cobbler's and a derelict tobacconist. A brass plaque above the door read, "The Tyndall Society for Mechanical and Natural Philosophy." Inside, the scent of lamp oil and old paper met us. A middle-aged woman with a pince-nez looked up from a ledger at the front desk. Holmes inclined his head. "We are seeking Professor Elias Greenwood. Is he lecturing today?" She raised an eyebrow. "Professor Greenwood resigned last year, gave up teaching altogether so far as we know. He did leave a forwarding address, however. I shall see whether I may still share it." Holmes gave her one of his rare, genuine smiles, though I knew it came as much from relief as charm. After a brief shuffle through her notes, she handed him a card. "E. Greenwood, Consultant Acoustician," it read. The address, an upper-floor flat in Limehouse, above a violin repair shop. As we stepped back into the street, Holmes exhaled slowly. "We are nearing the center of the web, Watson. I can feel the vibrations tightening." We arrived in Limehouse by 10:30, the district pulsing with dockside activity. Chinese merchants barked prices in a mix of Cantonese and English. Sailors staggered past with canvas sacks over their shoulders, and the smell of spices warred with the ever-present tang of tar and coal smoke. Holmes found the shop easily, a small wooden storefront with rows of violins hanging in the window like sleeping insects. The proprietor, a silent old man with milk-white eyes, nodded when Holmes asked for Professor Greenwood and gestured to the stairs behind the counter. Holmes took them 2 at a time. The upper landing was quiet. Holmes knocked once. There was no answer. He knocked again, more sharply. A pause, and then the door opened. The man who stood there was tall and gaunt, with a mane of silvery hair that fell past his collar. His eyes were sharp, though shadowed with fatigue, and his fingers bore the stains of varnish and graphite. He wore a frayed dressing gown over a threadbare shirt, and his voice, when it came, was dry and formal. "You've come about the bells." Holmes gave a small nod. "So you admit they're yours?" The man stepped aside, granting us entry. If you know to ask, then I needn't pretend otherwise. The room was a strange hybrid of music studio and engineering lab. Strings and tuning forks shared space with spools of copper wire, glass bell jars and rolls of blueprints stacked in a brass bin. On one table stood a prototype, not unlike the device we had seen underground, though smaller and neater. Holmes approached it, touching it only with his eyes. "You designed the bell transmitters. Why?" Greenwood settled, himself in a leather armchair, the light from the narrow window illuminating the hollows of his cheeks. "Because no one else would. Because certain messages cannot be written on paper or spoken aloud. Sound is safer. Memory carries it better than ink." Holmes's tone remained neutral. "You built a system to communicate through the underground using musical signals. How many others know of its existence?" Greenwood smiled faintly. "Enough, and fewer than you might think. It was never meant for a crowd, only couriers and guides. One hears the bells only if one has been taught how." "Then you are not the ringleader," Holmes said, "merely the engineer." "I built the bones," Greenwood agreed. "Others gave it flesh." "Who?" Holmes asked. "I cannot say." "You will say," Holmes said, stepping forward. "There was a chime last night. 3 bells. And it triggered something. We need to know what." Greenwood studied Holmes for a long moment, then turned his gaze to me. "You're Watson, aren't you?" I inclined my head, surprised. "I read your accounts," Greenwood said. "Most take Holmes for a magician. You, at least, give him gravity." "Let me ask you something, Doctor. Do you believe a man can be both good and guilty?" I hesitated. "I believe a man can be mistaken." Greenwood nodded slowly. "There's a group, the Concord Circle, they call themselves now. I taught 3 of them years ago at King's. Brilliant, idealistic, angry. They've been using the Bell system to coordinate exchanges. Sensitive material, illegal in parts of Europe, yes, but not bombs or weapons, not yet." "But something changed?" Holmes asked. Greenwood sighed. 6 weeks ago, a new man joined them, a financier, I believe. He offered funds, influence, expansion, but he was never a student. He spoke in legal terms, not philosophical ones. I never trusted him." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Name?" "I never learned it. They only called him the minor canon." I started. "That's a church rank." "Exactly," Greenwood said grimly. "A mockery, perhaps, or a warning." Holmes walked to the window and stood in silence for a time. Then he turned. "There will be a transfer at Finchley. We believe it may be violent." Greenwood stiffened. "No, Finchley was marked caution. I saw the notation." "Plans change," Holmes said. "What was originally a passage of ideas may have become something darker." Greenwood's mouth twisted. "If they've twisted my design into an engine for terror." He stood abruptly and walked to a drawer. From it he removed a folded sheet of vellum. "This is the original code, the Bell notations and what they mean. Some of the men may have altered it, but this will help you." He handed it to Holmes. Holmes took it without a word. Greenwood met his gaze. "I never meant for it to be used this way." "No one ever does," Holmes replied. "But intentions, like sound, echo." We left shortly after, and Holmes said little as we descended into the underground once again, this time bound for Finchley Road Station. In our compartment, Holmes studied the code with the intensity of a chess master reviewing a game mid-play. "There are 5 bells total," he murmured. 3 are used regularly, 2 are reserved for emergencies. The triple chime last night, FFB flat, was an alert. But not just of our presence. It may have been the order to move up the timetable. To make the transfer earlier? Exactly, and if the minor canon is involved, this is no longer about books, it's about power, control, a statement. We arrived at Finchley with an hour to spare before the listed transfer time. Holmes made contact with a constable from Lestrade's unit, posted discreetly in civilian dress. The station was quiet, too quiet for a weekday afternoon. Holmes paced the length of the platform listening. And then he froze. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears. A low chime. Once, then silence. Holmes's expression turned grim. "That was G sharp, one of the emergency codes. Watson, they're here." Holmes broke into motion the moment the chime died. He moved not like a man running, but like one who had already calculated the trajectory of every shadow in the station. I followed at his heels, our boots striking the stone in unison, our breath fogging in the cool subterranean air of Finchley Road's platforms. "There's a service tunnel just beyond the northbound track," Holmes hissed without looking back. "Used by engineers and rarely patrolled. That chime wasn't a warning for us. It was clearance, a go-ahead signal." We darted to the far end of the platform, drawing no attention from the sparse commuters waiting for their trains. Holmes vaulted the low gate marked "Maintenance Access" and pulled the heavy iron door with a screech. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor lit by the dim amber glow of a gas sconce. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something faintly metallic. We passed through the tunnel in silence until Holmes halted abruptly and held out a hand. I listened. A soft scuffing sound echoed ahead, and then the sound of a cart, a wheeled crate or trolley, being moved with care. Holmes drew his revolver from beneath his coat. "Quietly now," he whispered. We turned a corner and came upon the scene. Two men, one with a lantern and the other with gloved hands, resting atop a wooden crate mounted on a trolley. They were dressed as workmen, but there was nothing casual in the way they held themselves. They weren't labourers, they were operatives, hardened, practiced. Holmes stepped into view, his pistol raised. "Not another movement. Scotland Yard has this area under observation." The taller of the two froze. The shorter, a stockier man with a sharp jaw and a neatly trimmed beard, glanced behind him, perhaps gauging the distance too.
"Escape. Drop it," Holmes said coldly. But instead of obeying, the bearded man smiled. A sound rang out, chime, 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 from within his coat, a handbell, tuned and concealed. From behind us, the tunnel burst to life. Footsteps, more men. I turned just as three figures appeared at our rear, blocking the way we had come. One held a kosh, another a long knife. Holmes didn't flinch. "Watson, right flank." We turned as one and moved with force and speed I'd forgotten I possessed. Holmes fired once, high, shattering a sconce and plunging the tunnel into a chaos of shadows. I rushed the man with the knife, knocking him sideways against the wall as Holmes surged toward the crate. For a moment, everything was noise, shouts, the clang of metal, the squeal of the trolley as someone tried to shove it toward a darkened spur of track. Then a new sound broke through it all, a piercing, rising chime, unnatural and electronic in quality, unlike the gentle mechanical bells we'd heard before. "Get down!" Holmes shouted. We obeyed on instinct. A pulse, like the cracking of air under pressure, sounded from within the crate, not an explosion, but something deeper. A wave of vibration passed through the tunnel like a ripple through deep water. The lanterns shuddered on their hooks. Dust rained from the ceiling. One of the men shrieked and dropped his lantern. The others scattered. Holmes sprang to the crate and wrenched the lid open. Inside was no bomb nor books. It was a bell, polished, mounted on a metal platform and connected by wires to a crystalline mechanism of coils and hammers. A resonance generator. Holmes stared at it for half a breath, then cut the primary wire with his penknife. The bell let out a single, mournful chime. Then it fell silent. Lestrade arrived 10 minutes later with a detachment of uniformed men, breathless and pale-faced from their sprint through the emergency route Holmes had outlined in his earlier telegram. By that time, 2 of the men we had encountered had been apprehended, one with a dislocated shoulder, the other nursing a gash on the side of his head. The rest had vanished into the web of side tunnels, but not before dropping a small case of documents that Holmes had already seized. Lestrade stood over the disarmed resonance generator, his face one of disbelief. "Sound? Weapons?" he muttered. "I thought that was science fiction." "Not fiction," Holmes replied coolly. "But science," misapplied. "This machine wasn't meant to destroy, it was meant to control." Lestrade turned to him. "Control what?" "Crowds. Panic. Minds, even." This was a prototype, designed to emit ultra-low frequency pulses across the rail tunnels. With the right resonance, it could shatter glass, trigger nausea, cause disorientation. With multiple devices placed through the underground, it might even influence movement, cause passengers to flee, scatter, or stampede. I felt a chill crawl along my spine.
But to what end? Holmes knelt by the documents. "That, Watson, is what we must now determine." He opened the case. Inside, neatly organized, were maps, coded bell sequences, and a document stamped with the heading, Operation. Palimpsest. Holmes's eyebrows rose. "This was never about a smuggling network," he said. "Not entirely. The bell system, Greenwood's invention, was merely the infrastructure. The real plan was far more ambitious." He held up a list of station names: Oxford Circus, Liverpool Street, Embankment, all major transfer points in the city. Imagine, Watson, triggering carefully timed disturbances across these stations using undetectable sound, causing controlled chaos, drawing police resources thin, and then making your move. Lestrade paled. "What sort of move?" "A robbery, a political act, an abduction. We don't yet know, but now we know the key player behind it." Holmes turned one of the captured documents toward us. A single name had been typed in the corner. Canon E. Mordaunt. Holmes tapped the paper with his forefinger. "The minor canon." I leaned in. "So he's real?" "Oh, quite real," Holmes said. "And very nearly successful. But now we have his signature, his methodology, and, if my guess is correct, his next target." He stood, his expression hardening. "We must speak with Greenwood again. If he knows who Mordaunt is, truly, we may be able to catch him before the final bell tolls." Lestrade looked between us. "Final bell?" Holmes's gaze was unblinking. "Mordaunt has one more chime planned, and if he rings it, London will listen whether it wants to or not." We arrived at Elias Greenwood's Limehouse flat just past dusk. The air had grown colder, and the clatter of hooves and wheels on the slick cobbles below echoed up through the narrow alleys. A light still burned in Greenwood's window above the violin shop, casting a flickering silhouette of bent shoulders and restless pacing. Holmes led the way up the stairs, his tread swift and silent. He knocked sharply. There was no answer. Holmes frowned and knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. He pressed his ear to the door. "Something's off," he muttered. The pacing stopped. He drew back a step and, without further hesitation, drove his shoulder into the door. It burst open with a groan. The room beyond was still warm from the stove. A kettle hissed quietly on the hearth, but Greenwood was nowhere to be seen. Then Holmes spotted it, a smudge of soot on the floor leading toward the curtained alcove at the rear. He drew his revolver and approached. Greenwood was there, slumped on a chair, his head resting against the wall. He was breathing, barely, but a half-filled teacup lay shattered at his feet. Holmes knelt and pressed his fingers to Greenwood's throat. Alive, drugged, most likely. "Watson," I was already beside him, checking the pupils. Opium derivative.
Not fatal, but enough to render him unconscious for hours. The tea was laced. Holmes stood and surveyed the room. No sign of struggle. He trusted whoever delivered it. He moved swiftly to the desk. The original Bell schematics were gone. So too was the vellum code sheet. They cleaned him out, Holmes said. They knew we'd come back to speak with him, and they didn't want him talking. He turned and scanned the floor. There's a footprint in the soot, pointed toe, foreign make. And here, cigarette ash, Balkan blend, not Greenwood's. He scooped it into a small envelope. They left quickly, sloppy. That gives us an edge. What now? I asked. We wake the professor. I need names. It took half an hour for Greenwood to come round. Holmes administered a tincture of valerian and hartshorn, while I used cold compresses and gentle stimulation. At last, Greenwood stirred and opened his eyes. His face was slack with confusion. Mr. Holmes, Holmes leaned forward. You were poisoned. They came for your notes. They didn't kill you, but they silenced you temporarily. We believe Mordaunt was behind it. That name sparked something. Greenwood straightened slightly. I didn't think he'd come here. Holmes's voice was urgent but gentle. You know who he is. Tell us. Greenwood blinked slowly. I knew him under another name, Edward Moreau. He studied law at Balliol, but left abruptly. There were allegations of manipulation, blackmail. He vanished, then surfaced in revolutionary circles. But he wasn't one of them. He studied them. Like a scientist dissects an insect. And he joined the Concord Circle, I said. Not joined, Greenwood said bitterly. He took it over, with promises and gold and talk of vision. Some believed him. I didn't. Holmes stood. Moreau is Mordaunt. He's built your Bell system into a web of control. He nearly triggered a chain of sabotage and psychological panic across the underground, and he isn't finished. Greenwood coughed, then leaned forward with effort. He wanted something more. Not money, not books, a moment, a gesture, something unforgettable. He spoke once of a resonant act, a final note. Holmes went still. A single event to cap it all. Greenwood nodded. He spoke of a location, high walls, stone, a place where sound would echo and memory would linger, but he never said where. Holmes looked at me sharply. Watson, recall the list we found. Oxford Circus, Liverpool Street Embankment. I saw it then. None of them is true target. Holmes turned to Greenwood. Did he ever mention Westminster? Greenwood's eyes widened. Yes, once. He said it was the most resonant chamber in Britain. Holmes's jaw clenched. Then that's it. He plans to strike Parliament. Greenwood stared at him. You mean the House? Yes, using sound, not an explosion, something
subtler. A frequency device, perhaps one that incites panic, triggers mass confusion, sends Parliament into chaos during session. Greenwood gripped the arms of the chair. He said, let the government hear the people, even if the people never spoke. Holmes was already halfway to the door. Watson, come. Lestrade must be warned. We raced by cab through the darkened city, the lamps flickering past like spectres. Holmes gave orders to the driver in clipped tones, and as we rumbled past Westminster Bridge, he pointed ahead. The session resumed today at 6. If Moreau is to strike, it will be tonight. The great Gothic mass of the Palace of Westminster loomed over the Thames, its towers cutting into the sky. We disembarked and found Lestrade waiting by prior arrangement, surrounded by 2 constables in plain clothes. We've got men covering all entrances, Lestrade said. What's this about a sonic attack? Holmes didn't waste time. Not sound in the traditional sense, a directed resonance pulse intended to unnerve, to overwhelm. We believe Moreau intends to deploy it from within the chamber. Lestrade's eyes widened. But the security... He would have needed to pre-stage the equipment, possibly under the guise of maintenance or acoustical testing. Do you have access to the records? Lestrade gestured to one of his men who hurried off. Minutes later, we were inside the palace. The long corridors of Parliament glowed with gaslight, the stone echoing beneath our boots as Holmes led the way toward the Commons chamber. We found the room locked but not deserted. A junior attendant, pale and nervous, stood within. "We're just closing up," he said. "Maintenance was done yesterday. Something with the microphones and lectern system. Foreign firm, I believe. Sent in by—" He never finished. Holmes strode to the central lectern and crouched. There, beneath the speaking platform, was a small metal box. Smooth, polished. Wires fed into the floor beneath it. Holmes examined it quickly. Exactly as I feared. Not a bomb. A tuned emitter, set to activate once the house filled and the doors were shut. Lestrade stood stunned. What would it have done? Holmes glanced at the gallery overhead. Induced confusion, possibly fainting, nausea. Shouted words would have seemed distorted. Arguments would have escalated. Fists, collapse. Parliament thrown into disgrace, live, if the gallery were filled with press. He turned. Moreau's resonant act, a sound of silence and madness. Lestrade's constables carefully disabled the device under Holmes's supervision. As they removed it, a folded note was discovered taped to the inside lid. It read, "The louder the halls of power, the more easily they crack." M.C. Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his coat. "Watson," he said, with a quiet finality, "the minor canon doesn't play for applause, he plays for echoes." Lestrade approached, his tone hushed. "So, it's over?" Holmes shook his head. "No, it's paused. Moreau is a fugitive now, but he won't stop. He's not merely a criminal, he's an architect of moments. He will strike again." We stepped outside into the cold night. Big Ben began to toll the hour. Holmes looked up at it. "A bell," he said softly. "The greatest bell in London." Then he turned to me, the wind stirring his coat. "Let's go home, Watson. I think we've earned a moment of silence." The fog returned by morning, as if London herself were drawing a curtain across the city to blot out the memory of the night before. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street at first light, the gas lamps still glowing as the milkmen began their rounds. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but Holmes, as ever, seemed untouched by fatigue. His eyes remained sharp, and his every motion bore that tight-coiled energy that I had come to associate with the moments when his mind worked ahead of the world. He sat at the fireside, fingers steepled, while I brewed a strong pot of coffee. Neither of us spoke until the cups had been poured. Then, in a tone that was almost conversational, Holmes said, "He won't run?" I glanced up. "Moreau?" "He's too invested in his own mythos," Holmes said. "A man like Moreau doesn't flee in the face of exposure. He retreats, he observes, and then he reshapes his strategy. For him, it is not merely a matter of escape, it is performance." I sipped my coffee. "You think he'll strike again?" Holmes gave a small, grim smile. "I am certain of it, but not in the same way. The attempted disruption at Parliament failed, but he will not view it as a defeat. Rather, he will ask himself, what failed, what must change, and he will act accordingly." He rose and retrieved the documents we had secured from the intercepted crate at Finchley. As he spread the coded materials across the desk, I saw again the notations of bell tones, diagrams of the underground network, and timing charts of London's train system, along with a few entries marked simply Phase 2. Holmes tapped these entries with a slender forefinger.
"This," he said, "is our future. We must decipher it before he does." Lestrade arrived shortly before noon, his expression tired but resolute. He brought with him the early reports from the forensics team regarding the resonance device recovered from Parliament. "Designed with precision," he said. "Military-grade components. It seems this Moreau fellow has either very wealthy backers or connections we've yet to uncover." "He's always operated on the margins," Holmes replied. "Not just of law, but of loyalty. He doesn't believe in revolution for its own sake. He believes in disruption, destabilization as a principle. And now, thanks to his theft of Greenwood's designs, he possesses a method that is nearly undetectable." Lestrade frowned. "What do you recommend?" Holmes didn't hesitate. "We need to turn his method against him. Let him think the network is intact. Let him signal again." Lestrade nodded slowly. "You want to trap him?" "I want him to chime," Holmes corrected. "One more time. If we can predict his pattern based on the bell codes and Greenwood's original map, we can narrow down where he'll move next." Lestrade looked at me. "And you're all right with this, Doctor? Using the very system we just shut down to lure him back in?" I answered honestly. "If it brings Moreau to justice, then yes. But we must tread carefully. The bells may ring for us, or for our undoing." Holmes spent the next 2 days in a focused storm of activity. He barely slept, consumed an alarming quantity of tea and Turkish cigarettes, and filled page after page in his notebook with calculations, speculative diagrams and timelines. I assisted where I could, organizing the data and transcribing codes into a master chart. What began to emerge was a pattern not of targets, but tempo. Moreau did not strike in straight lines, he struck in rhythms. His movements followed not geography, but a kind of criminal cadence. He used silence as deliberately as action. Holmes explained it to me late one night. "Watson, think of his operations like a musical fugue. Repetition, escalation, then inversion. He makes a statement, an initial bell. Then he expands it, echoes it across another location. The third phase is always deviation, the surprise note. That's where we must catch him." "But where?" Holmes rose and placed a pin on the wall map we had constructed. "Here." I squinted. "The old Smithfield freight terminal, but it's been closed for years." "Exactly," Holmes said. "It is acoustically rich, structurally complex, and, most importantly, connected to multiple disused branches of the underground. It would allow Moreau to reach any number of targets after delivering his note. It's his organ, Watson, his final instrument." Lestrade agreed to the plan. A team was deployed in secrecy. Holmes and I joined them at the Smithfield terminal under cover of darkness on the third night. The air was sharp, and the derelict building loomed like a cathedral of rusted iron and brick. Echoes bounced through its broken vaults with uncanny clarity. We waited. Holmes sat apart from the rest of us, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the far end of the terminal where the shadow of an old freight elevator yawned like a mouth. He listened, every muscle taut. Then softly, faintly chime. The tone was low, a single bell, then another, 2 seconds later. Holmes stood. "That's A and E flat, phase 3, he drew his revolver. "It's tonight." Movement from the west stairwell. 3 men, all in dark coats, moving with precision. One wheeled a cart bearing a reinforced case. Another held what appeared to be a lantern, but no, flame glowed within it. Lestrade and his men stepped forward. "Police, do not move!" The 3 froze, but one stepped forward. Even at a distance I recognized him. Thin frame, long coat, greying beard, composed, Edward Moreau. He smiled. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and almost amused, "it appears I've miscalculated my finale." Holmes advanced slowly. "You always had an affinity for the dramatic, but not every bell rings for glory. Some toll for judgment." Moreau raised his hands. "Then let us proceed with yours."
And with that, he pressed something in his pocket. A high chime rang out, C-sharp, bright and fast. A trap. A second cart, hidden under canvas near the terminal entrance, shuddered and began to whine. Holmes shouted, "Get clear! Disruptor!" The device pulsed once, then stopped. Greenwood had modified the signal map. The fail-safe Holmes had designed into the plan kicked in. A false echo bounced through a controlled relay loop we had placed earlier. It had tricked the signal into misfiring. Moreau's face faltered. Holmes advanced, revolver raised. "This isn't your symphony anymore." Moreau made no attempt to run. Lestrade's men surrounded him. His two associates were already on the ground, bound and silent. As the echo of the failed chime faded into the vaults, Moreau was led away in cuffs. Holmes stood in the quiet that followed, staring at the place where the pulse had died. "That was his final note," I said softly. Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "It was the overture to what comes next." And in that silence, deeper than sound, I understood. For every bell that had rung, another had yet to be heard. The following morning broke clear and cold, sunlight glancing off the frost-flecked windows of Baker Street. Inside, Holmes paced the length of our sitting room like a caged hound, his long fingers flicking absently at the lapel of his dressing gown. Though Edward Moreau had been captured, Holmes showed none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied the unmasking of a criminal mind. Instead, there was tension in his movements and a distant, unsettled gleam in his eyes. I set aside my notes from the previous night's events and cleared my throat. "Holmes, I would have thought you'd be content. Moreau is in custody and his network lies in shambles." Holmes stopped before the window and looked out at the street below, where a chimney sweep was calling out the day's rounds. Content? Hardly. Moreau allowed himself to be caught? I blinked. "You mean intentionally?" Holmes turned toward me, his gaze sharp. He pressed the trigger. Knowing we had placed a disruptor relay, he smiled, "Watson. That is not the smile of a man who has been thwarted. It is the smile of a man who has succeeded at something we haven't yet seen." I frowned. But what could he possibly have gained? His devices have been seized, his men are arrested, and the bell system is compromised. Holmes sat, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. That is what troubles me. His objective may not have been the devices at all. The machinery, the disruption, those were but instruments. His true aim, I believe, was information. He rose suddenly and crossed to his desk, pulling out the map of the London Underground and laying it flat across the table. "Watson, look here, the pattern of bell signals we intercepted, their frequencies, the intervals, the tempo. Greenwood designed the bell system to encode messages, but Moreau altered the tempo, not to confuse but to convey. To whom? That is what I intend to find out." He rummaged through a stack of confiscated documents and pulled out a folded sheet bearing notations in Greenwood's hand, musical sequences, timing charts, and annotations. Holmes pointed to one entry marked Phase 4, Steeple Echo. "This line, do you see? It's not an instruction, it's a broadcast. A message sent out through the resonance field of the final bell. A message to be received. By whom I do not yet know, but it was transmitted. Our instruments at Smithfield recorded the frequency. It was harmless, inaudible even, but I suspect it was meant for someone on the outside." Holmes turned sharply. "We must speak with Moreau again, today, before word of his arrest spreads too widely. If there is another player beyond him, we must draw them into the open." The interview room at Scotland Yard was cold and bare, with only a table, 2 chairs, and a single gas lamp burning above. Moreau sat at ease, dressed now in the drab grey of a remand uniform. He greeted us with a faint nod and an infuriatingly mild smile. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "or should I call you Conductor Emeritus?" Holmes ignored the jibe and took the seat opposite him. I stood at his shoulder. "You signalled," Holmes said without preamble. Moreau's brows lifted. "Indeed?" "Through the bell system, a sequence coded into the final frequency. Your phase 4. Moreau laced his fingers on the table. "You surprise me, Holmes. I did not expect anyone to decode it so swiftly. Greenwood must have helped." "He did," Holmes said, unwillingly but necessarily. Moreau chuckled. "How poetic! He gave life to the system, and in the end, it unmade him." Holmes leaned forward. "To whom were you signalling?" A pause. Then, with perfect calm, Moreau said, "The next voice." I felt a chill run through me. Holmes's tone darkened. "You mean there are others?" "Oh, Mr. Holmes," Moreau replied, "there are always others. Do you believe ideas are bound by iron bars? Do you believe a bell ceases to exist once it stops ringing?" Holmes said nothing. Moreau went on. "The resonance network you uncovered, it was only the first experiment, a study in influence. But now that the system has been exposed, it will be rebuilt, better, quieter. All it takes is the right materials, the right silence." "You'll be moved to Belmarsh within the week," Holmes said quietly. "You'll have no contact with the outside world." Moreau smiled. "I've already made contact, Mr. Holmes. The bell has rung, the message is travelling even now, and whoever hears it will build the next tower." Holmes stood abruptly. "We're done here." Moreau watched him go, still smiling. Outside the interview room, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. His jaw worked tightly, and his hands were clenched at his sides. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I believe he believes it. And that makes him more dangerous now than he ever was with wires and bells." We returned to Baker Street and worked late into the night. Holmes was determined to trace the resonance signal. Using the recordings taken by Lestrade's men, he built a reconstruction of the sonic pulse and compared it to known bell sequences. At last, he found a match, not in a police file but in a musical journal. "A coded fugue," he murmured, "a layered bell piece, published under a pseudonym in the Acoustician's Review 6 months ago." He turned the page to reveal the byline, L.H. Merrow. "An alias?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Likely a student of Greenwood, possibly even someone we've met." He stared down at the sheet music. "Watson," he said, "we may have stopped Moreau, but the symphony is not over. Another conductor has taken up the baton." He rose and looked out into the street. "And when they strike, we must be ready, not with bullets or handcuffs, but with silence, with listening." Outside, a bell rang in the distance, a street cellar perhaps, or the hour being tolled from a chapel. Holmes closed his eyes. "Even now," he said softly, "London rings with hidden notes." And though I could not hear them, I believed him. It was a week after Moreau's arrest, and London had returned, at least outwardly, to its usual rhythm. The hansom cabs clattered along the frost-touched avenues. The bells of St. Martin in the Fields tolled midday over Trafalgar Square, and the Parliament carried on with its sober debates as though it had not nearly fallen to chaos from an unseen frequency. But in our rooms at Baker Street, the atmosphere was far from placid. Holmes sat, his gaze fixed on the blue-grey smoke curling from the bowl of his pipe, watching it rise like a ribbon into the gaslight. On the floor lay a dozen newspaper clippings. Some reported Moreau's arrest, couched in vague terms by order of the Home Office, while others made casual mention of a failed electrical experiment beneath Finchley. But none revealed the full story. and that, as Holmes observed more than once, was precisely the point. "There are melodies, Watson," he murmured, "that are only dangerous if heard in full." I sat opposite him, reviewing the coded documents we had yet to decipher, notes taken from Moreau's crate, pages from Greenwood's original manuscripts, and cryptic annotations that seemed less like language and more like music notation for the deaf. "Do you truly believe," I asked, "that there is another? Someone already preparing to rebuild what Moreau began?" Holmes gave a short nod. "Moreau fancied himself a conductor, but someone composed the score. I suspect the real architect never intended to be seen. The bell system was a prototype, a proof of concept. When it failed, it was merely discarded, quietly." He tapped the stem of his pipe against his knee, eyes narrowing. "But that final broadcast, Phase 5, it wasn't just a signal to the next voice. It was also a test to see whether we were listening. And we were." A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. It was Lestrade. He entered with the air of a man carrying news, not yet fully understood. "You'd better see this," he said, without preamble, handing Holmes a folded sheet of notepaper. Holmes unfolded it and scanned the contents. I could see his eyes flick rapidly, line by line, and then widen, not with shock, but with deepening focus. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed the page to me. It was a transcription, taken from a letter intercepted by postal surveillance, addressed to a non-existent recipient at a fictitious address in Berlin. The body of the letter was brief and apparently meaningless to the casual reader, but not to Holmes. It read, "The bells were muffled, but the tone survived. The tower holds yet. The next passage will not ring aloud, but hum beneath. The diagram is sound. Await tuning." There was no signature, only a postscript, LHM. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then to Lestrade he said, "Where was this intercepted?" "Paddington. Sorting office flagged it. We ran it through our list of known aliases." L.H. Merrow came up immediately. "Merrow," Holmes repeated. "We saw that name in the musical journal, the article detailing Greenwood's resonance theory." He returned to his desk and pulled open a folder from the stack of research materials. From it, he drew the journal in question, the Acoustician's Review, and turned to the annotated article. Merrow's diagram had been partially reprinted, a technical curiosity dismissed by most readers, but now, with the letter's reference to the diagram, it carried a new weight. "Look here," Holmes said, pointing to a segment of the diagram. "This portion overlays with the old pneumatic post lines that crisscrossed the city before the expansion of the electric telegraph. These tunnels are largely abandoned, but still accessible, and silent." "Silent?" Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded. "Perfect for relaying undetected sonic transmissions. And, from the phrasing of the letter, what the next passage will hum beneath, we may infer that whoever wrote this plans to transmit not through bells, but through vibration. Low-frequency resonance, unheard but felt." Lestrade swore under his breath. "They're adapting the method." Holmes tapped the page with his forefinger. "They're refining it." I leaned forward. "But if we know the route, can we intercept the signal?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "First, we must confirm the origin point. The wording suggests an established location. The tower holds yet. That may be metaphorical or literal. There are only a handful of towers in London that both stand above major tunnel lines and offer interior structural resonance." He strode to the map we had hung on the wall and circled 3 points: the Victoria Tower at Westminster, St. Mary-le-Bow in Cheapside, and the White Tower of the Tower of London. "All 3 are possible," he said, "but only one sits directly atop the disused pneumatic line running east to west." He circled the Tower of London. Lestrade exhaled. If they're using that site, they're making a statement, Holmes finished. History, power, and fear, all in one. Within an hour, Holmes had arranged for quiet access to the substructures beneath the tower, accompanied by Lestrade and myself. We entered through a rarely used maintenance stair near the river-facing wall, descending into the oldest parts of the fortress. Down there, history pressed close. The air was cold and thick with the scent of limestone and iron. Dust coated the floors in a film disturbed only by rats and the occasional patrolling guard. Holmes moved with surety, consulting a chart he had sketched based on the old postline diagrams. At last, we reached a locked iron gate, beyond which a bricked shaft sloped downward into blackness. Holmes examined the floor before it. Dust had been swept away recently. "They've been here," he said, "more than once." We forced the gate and descended. The shaft opened into a chamber perhaps 20 feet across, its walls lined with rusted piping and remnants of the pneumatic system. But at the center, placed like an altar, was a new structure, a black iron pillar, humming faintly. Holmes crouched before it. "Electromagnetic drivers," he murmured. "No bells, no chimes, but this would generate subsonic vibration strong enough to travel through the very stone of the city." He touched the pillar. "It's live, but not broadcasting, not yet." A note was affixed to its base. Holmes peeled it free and read it aloud. "Silence is only a louder kind of sound. When next you walk above, listen to what the stones remember. LHM." Holmes pocketed the note. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and looked around the chamber with an expression I had only seen a handful of times before, calm, resolved, and sharpened like a scalpel. "This was not a final act," he said. "It was a rehearsal." Lestrade nodded slowly. "What do we do?" Holmes turned toward the tunnel. "We dismantle it, quietly, and we wait, not for the next bell, but for the silence that follows. That is when the real message will come." We emerged into the pale winter daylight, the tower rising behind us like a sentinel of old. Holmes paused and looked up at its weathered stones, and then, softly, he said, "They thought they could use sound to disrupt the city, but they've forgotten something." I turned. "What's that?" He looked at me, and there was something almost fierce in his smile. "London listens back," and so it ended, for now. But even in the quiet, we knew the city still rang, in frequencies too low for the ear, too deep for ordinary men, but not too deep for Holmes. The bells had rung and would ring again. And he would be ready. It was a fortnight after we discovered the resonance pillar beneath the Tower of London, and though the device had been removed and the tunnels sealed under official silence, Holmes remained unsettled. He did not say so directly, he rarely did, but I knew the signs, the way he played the violin late into the night with no discernible melody, the sudden bursts of activity followed by long spells of contemplative stillness. Something in his mind remained unfinished. On one such morning, as I returned from my rounds, I found Holmes seated at the breakfast table, a sheet of notepaper before him, untouched toast beside it. He held his violin under one arm but did not play it. His eyes were fixed on the page. "Watson," he said without preamble, "tell me, what is the one element that binds a system of communication based on sound?" I considered. "A receiver. One must hear the message." "Just so," Holmes said, his fingers tapping the tabletop. "And where one receives, one may also record." He slid the page toward me. It bore a list of signal times from the Smithfield terminal, 7 sequences Holmes had previously marked as decoys. But beneath the last entry he had written, "Transmission intercepted. Content unknown." Holmes stood, his expression sharpening. There is one element we failed to consider, Watson. Not the sender nor the structure, but the listener. Moreau's final act was not to control, but to draw out. I frowned. Draw out whom? Holmes crossed to the fireplace and withdrew a slim envelope from the mantel. He held it up. This was delivered to Baker Street last night. No stamp, no name. Inside, only this. He handed me the contents. A fragment of sheet music, handwritten, with 4 bars of an unfinished fugue. Holmes explained, it matches the resonance pattern of the second device, but this isn't instruction, it's invitation. To what? Holmes turned, the firelight catching in his eyes. To a meeting. The location, once decoded from the notes, proved to be the Whispering Gallery in St. Paul's Cathedral. At Holmes's insistence, we arrived not during service hours, but in the early evening, when the great dome stood quiet and the whisper chamber held only ghosts and echoes. We waited, and then footsteps. A slender figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in a simple grey coat, a scarf pulled high over the face. Holmes spoke first. L.H. Merrow, I presume? The figure removed the scarf. It was a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, with calm eyes and the bearing of someone used to being underestimated. You expected someone else, she said with a smile. I expected someone, Holmes replied. The code was precise. She stepped closer. You understood it. That confirms my faith in you, Mr. Holmes. You should know, Moreau was never meant to complete the work. He was a spark, nothing more. Holmes's voice was low. And you are the fire? I am the listener, she said. And the next voice? The bell was never the threat. It was the attention it summoned. Holmes nodded slowly. So it was never about the message. It was about the audience. She smiled faintly. You understand now, what was begun will not end with arrests. Ideas resonate, Mr. Holmes, as do questions. Your interference confirmed that the system works. You completed the circle. Holmes stepped forward. But why reveal yourself now? Because now it is no longer dangerous to do so, she said. The structure is already being rewritten elsewhere, quieter, deeper. London listens, yes, but it also forgets. Holmes studied her in silence, then reached into his coat and withdrew the sheet of music. And this? A gift, she said. Proof that what you stopped was merely the overture. Then with a nod, she turned and disappeared down the stone stair, her footsteps fading in the whispering arc of the dome. We did not pursue her. Outside, Holmes was silent until we reached the street. She will vanish, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. For now. You're letting her go. I'm acknowledging her timing, he said. She wanted to be seen, just as Moreau wanted to be caught. These are not common criminals, Watson. They are engineers of belief. He looked up at the dome, where the last rays of the sun lit the cross at its apex. But belief, he added softly, is not unassailable. It must be challenged. He turned back toward the city. Come, Watson, there will be other bells. And we must be ready not just to silence them, but to understand what they're trying to say. And so ended the affair of the bells that rang underground. It was not, in the end, a case of murder, nor theft, nor even treason in the traditional sense. But it was perhaps more dangerous than all three, for it revealed that in the heart of London, beneath the streets and between the bricks, voices still seek to speak, not in words, but in resonance. And Sherlock Holmes, ever the listener, hears them still,